Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit, and welcome to this week's contemplation. So this is an episode where I share some of my thoughts, reflections, and contemplations for the energy and the astrology of the week of September 4th, 2023. And to begin, I would like to invite us into co-creating a contemplative space, and I decided to go with a little bibliomancy exercise just because I really enjoyed it last week. And this week, the text that I decided to use is a pretty profound text called The Tao of Healing, Meditations for Body and Spirit. It's written by Haven Trevino. And when I randomly chose a page in this book, it guided me to chapter 70. So I invite you to listen to this particular verse, this particular chapter, and to sense into and to track what comes up within you. Part of creating a contemplative space for yourself is to begin listening to your own inner voice, right? And so, I invite you to sense into what wants to surface for you as I'm reading this. It is simple to feel, yet few feel it. It is the feeling of ancient origin, the emotion that births creation. Available to all, expressed by few. The arrogant see it, yet do not know it and deride it. This diamond spark that dwells in a crude vessel of clay. Spirit and body go hungry when outcome takes precedence over love. So giving yourself a little bit of space, allowing whatever wants to come through, even if it's a feeling or a sensation or a memory that seems unrelated. You may also want to pause this recording if that's your jam and maybe note down some of your observations about what's coming up. The passage or maybe the phrase that really jumped out at me was this idea of the diamond spark, right? The diamond spark that dwells in a crude vessel of clay. To me, this is really speaking to something that I feel is extremely alive in the astrology of the coming week. So in this coming week, we have essentially a lineup of a lot of transits and activations that are all centered around earth signs. And it's very interesting because I think earth signs can get kind of a bad reputation. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. But I feel that there is this deeper invitation, right, to really deepen into the essence of things, including the things that we are considering as mundane things, the things that are chores, the things that are not glamorous, and to allow ourselves to dial into the small moments of ordinary aliveness. So on Monday, the 4th, Mercury, which is currently retrograde in Virgo, will create a trine to Jupiter in Taurus. And then Jupiter will station retrograde. And while Jupiter is stationing retrograde, Jupiter is conjoined the moon, which is exalted in Taurus. And both Jupiter and the moon will be ruled by a Venus that's moving slow, but moving direct. So if you've been following the astrology, you're probably aware that we have just come out of a Venus retrograde. And so I do feel like even though as Venus goes direct, Jupiter stations retrograde, I do feel like this is going to be a shift in the symphony of the cosmic dance, right? Because this Jupiter that's going retrograde is answering to that Venus that's going direct, you know? And then on Wednesday the 6th, the Sun in Virgo will conjoin Mercury, which is retrograde in Virgo, right? And this is what we call the cazimi moment. And it can really bring up like some ahas, some eye-opening moments. And we'll talk more specifically about how that responds to, or how that correlates with the archetype of Virgo. And on Friday, the 8th, Sun in Virgo will create a trine to Jupiter, which is, as I mentioned, retrograde in Taurus, right? And so essentially, the two main players of this week are Virgo and Taurus, right? The signs of Virgo and Taurus. And the planets that are involved are Mercury, Jupiter, and the Sun. And so with whenever we have a lot of Earth sign activations, there is an unraveling and an untangling of our perception of earthly matters, our conception of reality that is often needed in order for us to spiral closer to the wisdom of earth signs, right? To what earth signs really want us to see. And specifically, Taurus is what we call a fixed earth sign in astrology, and Virgo is what we call a mutable earth sign, right? And so there is something about, I think, contemplating on the immutability, right, of the earth matters, the things that we accept as part and parcel of being alive, right, of being on this planet, and also how change is actually always operative, right? Like when we think about change, it's actually impossible for us to be alive without constantly changing shapes, you know? And that is true for as long as you are a part of this planet, right? Because even the things that we consider dead or not alive are always shifting. Think about buildings. You know, this is something that I've been really contemplating on a lot, right? We often, in our culture, create this division between the spiritual and the mundane, right? Between nature and civilization. And so I live in New York City, and when I walk around in New York and I look at a building, like an apartment building or an office building, I don't really think about these buildings as being alive, right? But the reality is, if any of you have ever come across abandoned buildings, you'll know that abandoned buildings, things start to grow on them, right? There may be mold infestations, right? There may be various plants, you know, growing in that building. And so in some ways, that's also evidence, right? That's also pointing us to the direction of realizing that even buildings, you know, the epitome of human civilization, right? What we consider as definitely not natural are always shifting, right? And similarly, when we think about plants, you know, when plants decompose, right? Decomposition is actually an active process. Decomposition is not just like the plant doing nothing and like being frozen in time, right? very rarely on this earth, under very specific and pretty extreme circumstances, do we see things kind of frozen in a shape, right, in a form that they've been holding. Usually things mutate and shift, especially when it's interacting with particles in the air, right? When it's interacting with alive beings that are moving around in the air that we can't really see with our naked eye, right? Doesn't mean that they're not there, right? And so this intertangled web of reality, right, of aliveness is always at play. And so it's then really interesting thinking about the connection of, what we consider, like even the division, right, of like nature versus not nature. Because I think in considering these arbitrary divisions that we have created based on our perspective, on our worldview, on our ontology, we also get to see what else are the separations that have been created, right? One separation that it's making me think of this particular transit, right? Considering Virgo and Taurus, considering Jupiter going retrograde and Mercury going retrograde, what I'm considering is the idea of spirit versus matter, right? Recently, one of my friends and teachers, Xenia Varai, talked about, and her handle on Instagram is @mythsofcreation, and I'll link her below so you can find her work. I really love reading her posts on Instagram. I feel like it always really enriches my perspective. And recently, in a container that I'm in, she was talking about this idea of spiritual bypassing, right? And how spiritual bypassing is essentially, we understand spiritual bypassing to point to this phenomenon where someone is so focused on this like spirit perspective, this larger picture perspective, that they don't really honor their current lived experience, right? And Xenia was talking about how throughout her life, when she reflects back on her life, what she's been doing is kind of the opposite, which is material bypassing, right? Where she is so focused on what is tangible, right? What can be scientifically proven, that she kind of shuts down her intuitive knowing, her unexplained instinct, right? Of knowing that something's moving through, or this experience that can't fully be explained using the language and the framework that we have to explain that material reality, right? And this idea of spiritual bypassing versus material bypassing is making me think about how, so some of you may know that I have been studying energy healing alongside astrology for a while now. One of my mentors is Deborah Kramins, and in the very first class that I ever had with Deborah, she talked about this concept that everything is made up of energy, right? And I call it a concept because I think it's a really interesting thought, because whether you agree with it or not, or whether you think of it as true or not, is to me really dependent on a couple things, right? One is your worldview, and two is what you define as energy, right? But say, for argument's sake, that the smallest particle or the smallest atom, right, that makes up everything in this universe, or at least on this earth, is what we call energy, right? Or has energy running through it. Then if we think of everything as being made up of energy, then the world that we are currently seeing right now are basically manifestations of how dense the energy is, right? And this has nothing to do with any sort of moral judgment, right, around it. This is basically just a way to explain that phenomena, right? That the density of energy creates, the more dense energy crystallizes, the more solid an object becomes, right? Like, for example, I'm currently looking at my laptop or my microphone or my fingers, right? And these are very solid objects. I can use my hands, my physical touch senses to be able to hold on to these items, right? And so they are energy that is solid. Whereas some other things are not as solid, right? Like the wind, for example. The wind blows and I can feel the wind, I can experience the wind, but I can't necessarily hold the wind, or the ripples, right, that are happening in the surface of the Hudson River here in New York, right? I can't really capture that or necessarily even touch that, but I can see that it's happening, right? And so I think it's interesting thinking about different materials in this world, right? And why do we consider some things material and why do we consider other things spiritual or not material or somewhere in between, right? And so to engage more deeply with earth signs is to engage more deeply with our mundane reality, right? With the things that we consider as grievances, even, of things that are just liabilities for being alive, right? I'm thinking about how, when we look at our bodies, for example, right? Our bodies require constant maintenance. Like, in order for you to survive, you need to eat, right? Some people may be able to go on without eating or drinking for a lot longer than some other people, but it doesn't mean that you can continue your aliveness without eating. And so there is something kind of mundane about tending to the earthly, right? And a week like this coming week may really point our attention to questions like, are there systems, that I need to tend to in my life, right? Maybe systems around my hygiene, my sleep hygiene or my technology hygiene or what I've been eating, right? Are there things in my body that need tending to? And I think that one of the biggest illusions of our so-called Western civilization is this division, right, that we create between the spirit, the imagination, versus the body and the mundane. To me, this is where we get really tangled up and where we create a lot of energetic imbalances for ourselves. For example, something that's come up for me this past week that I think may really illuminate some of the things that may amplify this coming week is I got this pop-up notification on my laptop that says I need to clear up some space in my computer, right? And these are things that I honestly didn't really like doing. I had to move some of my files into an external drive, and then I had to figure out which files I need, which files I don't need, and then start deleting them, making space in my computer, right? There's kind of a repetitive quality to it, and yet, I think when we begin approaching these mundane, repetitive tasks with an awareness that material space also creates spiritual space, also creates space internally for inspiration to begin coming into us, we begin to approach these tasks with a different attitude, right? Something I notice for myself as a Virgo rising time and time again is I always get so resistant with cleaning my space, right? With reorganizing my space. But every single time I do it, not only do I feel better, but I am just blessed with so much aha moments, when I'm cleaning, when I'm reorganizing my desk, when I put things back where they belong that I've been allowing to kind of get a little bit out of control in my space. I notice myself relating to my spirit differently, right? And so what does that say about the connection between the mundane and the spirit, right? I think a lot of us who listen to this podcast we tend to probably be the kinds of people who are quite in touch with our spiritual, with our mystic sides, right? We tend to be people who are not super afraid, at least to ourselves, right, to our own selves, to validate our experiences that feel spiritual or that feel like they are connected to the unseen, right? But I tend to find that a lot of us are more comfortable in the unseen realm, and the other group is more comfortable in the seen realm, right? And I think when we allow a lot of our identities to be invested in being camp A or camp B, then there's a little bit of resistance there, right? We are putting ourselves into a box. We are enforcing a certain binary that isn't actually part of the truth of our reality, because our wholeness actually embrace all of the above, right? It makes a lot of sense that as you do your spiritual practices, right, your body may feel differently. Some sort of space may open up for you to tend to parts of your lived experience that you maybe didn't have space to tend to before, and it may also be true that as you tend to the mundane things, there's also more space to do these deeper spiritual excavations, right? And it's kind of reminding me of how, there is that Zen koan, right, which is quite famous, that says something along the lines of, to get to enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, right? And something to also consider as we are tending to the mundane, as we are tending to the parts of us that maybe we don't really like to do, right? Things like reorganizing the house, clearing our desks, cleaning the house, maybe doing our taxes, right? Itemizing our expenses, things that seem boring, to the part of us that wants to just kind of live this big, fabulous, dramatic lives, which is also really cool. One thing to consider too is that I think if that's what you decide to tend to, if you decide to tend to the smaller things, the finer things in life, you might find that if you begin noticing patterns of your thoughts, judgments that you have around your current reality, you might find that there's something there for you to begin questioning and maybe begin relaxing, right? For me specifically, there's a part of me that tends to get quite hard on myself when it comes to needing to have everything be put together, right? Or needing to have everything be in its right order. And so when I'm part of my resistance to tending to these mundane tasks have to do with like how if you would like to go there, right? If you would like to look at the mundane tasks, you need to also confront the chaos, right? That it's currently, the current state of chaos that it's currently in. And so that requires a certain level of sobriety, right? And also maybe even courage, and this is where I'm really thinking about this Jupiter retrograde, right? That's being ruled by Venus in Leo, currently stationing direct, right? Because there is something about our ability, our willingness to be taught by the material aspect of our lives, by tending to the material aspects of our lives, that really speaks to, that requires a lot of courage, that requires us to return to our heart selves, right? And to have compassion for ourselves as we patiently move through the act of decluttering, or the act of clearing your inbox, right? And to me, all of this is also really good activities to be engaging with during a Mercury retrograde, right? Because Mercury retrogrades feel to me like maybe not a super fertile soil for launching new ideas or for going really deeply into interests that we may have had that reside within the conceptual realm, right? Mercury retrograde is great for sorting things out, for especially in Virgo, for highlighting, this Mercury cazimi specifically, right? The Sun meeting Mercury, I think is such a great time to be highlighting where, in the ways that we organize our lives, have we actually created more obstacles for ourselves that are unnecessary and that may be getting in the way of inspiration coming through for us. So I'm going to give you an example, right? I'm a songwriter. I write songs. I love writing songs. And the past few years, I've noticed that I've been writing a certain kind of song, and I'm getting bored of the kinds of songs that I'm writing. And when I start to look at why are the songs that I'm writing sounding like this, I started to realize that part of why the songs sound the way they do is actually because of my process. It has a lot to do with my process, which is that in the past few years, I've been writing songs at the piano. And when I write at the piano, what happens is that my fingers, right, have this muscle memory that goes to certain chords, and there are certain kinds of songs that work better when you are at the piano. They tend to be ballads. They tend to be slightly slower and have this kind of longer phrases, right? Melancholic quality to them. And I was wondering, why is this the case? I used to not write like this. And then I realized that back in the days when I was writing songs that felt more upbeat to me or have more of a rhythmic quality, it was because I was writing with the guitar. And at some point, I had some issues with the strings of one of my guitars, and I just literally got so frustrated, and I just cut all of the strings. And since then, I haven't put new strings on my guitar. And so I haven't been writing with my guitar. I haven't been walking around. The other way that I used to write songs was I used to walk around, and I used to be writing songs on the subway, which always seemed to really inspire me for some really weird reason. But I used to engage with that, and I haven't been doing that for the past couple of years, and so this is, I think, such a great example, right? When we're looking at our creative lives, our creative output is so often directly informed by our processes, right? Our systems, our habits. And so that's an invitation for you to look at your process. How are you in your mind, right, creating a conceptual divide between your process, inspiration, and a product, right? Where are you believing that, I'm just waiting for inspiration to come to me? When in reality, maybe there's something about your process that hasn't been super conducive to inspiration finding you, right? I think that it's also really powerful to work with this transit from the other perspective, right? So we've been talking a lot about how we can work with, the deeper we go into, to bring back the passage I was reading, right? The deeper we go into that vessel of clay, the more we can see that diamond spark, right? As Haven Trevino so beautifully phrased. And I think the opposite is also true, right? That as we allow ourselves to feel resourced on a deeper spiritual level, we can also find the missing piece that can lead us to having the courage to look at where our processes or where our systems may not have been really serving us, right? So I'd like you to contemplate, how might you resource yourself to dilate your awareness, right, of this tangible web of life that holds you, right? I've been thinking a lot about how, especially, I think in the spiritual community, I don't know, I have a fraught relationship with that word because I feel like it's a little bit, it feels like an assumption on my part, right? Like I'm talking about the spiritual communities that I am a part of. Yeah, let me put it that way. In a lot of the spiritual communities that I'm a part of, I've been noticing that there is a huge uptick in people becoming more and more aware of the importance of somatic practices, right? And I think this is such a great awareness, right? This is such a great blossoming of people wanting to becoming more curious of what their body is experiencing. And I think it's also really easy to start dividing. So something that I learned from one of my teachers, Nick Werber, is how a lot of somatic practices or somatic modalities actually grew out of or was born as a reaction, right, against the way that Western psychology tends to separate the mind and prioritizes the mind and thought patterns, and divorcing that from the body, right? There is this stereotype of therapists that go deeper and deeper into core woundings, stories about one's mother and father and primary caretaker, but then in continuing to dig deeper into the story, if one is not careful, one is removing the lived experience within the body, right? That changing the story or becoming aware of the story is not always the most effective or efficient way to shift patterns, right? Because the patterns are actually encoded in the body, right? So a lot of somatic practices grow out of this idea, right? That actually the mind and the body are not separate. And so what's interesting is to then see this blossoming of somatic practices. There can be a part of us, right? I include myself in this, that then wants to stop the processes of the mind, right? To not, to feel like, oh, if I'm doing my somatic practices correctly, I'm going to stop thinking, But that's actually making further divisions, right? Between the body and the mind, which goes against the spirit of a lot of these somatic modalities. The spirit of these somatic modalities is to embrace the whole, right? So, I've been thinking a lot about what it means for us to include our minds, our bodies, our hearts, all of the organisms, all of the particles that make up who we are, and allow the totality of that, right, to notice how all of this as a whole, as a system, interact with the world, right? What might happen when we begin relating to the world, with our whole being, rather than feeling like we need to chop up different parts of us, right? And so what I would want to invite you to consider are what practices make you feel connected, both internally and to what feels like it's external, to you, right? Like, for example, I've been doing this practice of walking outside and saying hello to the moon, and what I've noticed is that I grow increased sensitivity, right? When I allow myself to walk alongside the moon, there is a part of me that gets awakened, right? It's hard to totally describe in words what that part is doing or what that part even is, but I think that there's a deepening, to parts of myself that I maybe haven't been fully sensitive to, I haven't been fully attuning to for a while. You might find that for you, in order to come into a sense of balance with the world, you need to orient towards different kinds of foods, right? That maybe certain types of foods. I certainly feel this with like whole foods, right? With fruits and vegetables, that as I allow myself to consume more of them, I feel some level of balance and connection, and trust me, there's nothing I like more than mac and cheese and burger and fries and milkshake, truly. But understanding that the primary item on my menu needs to be these whole foods, that makes me feel able to hold a certain level of baseline balance with myself, right? Feels really good to me. Maybe for you, the practice that brings you balance is coming back to a place, to remember the sense of being held. For me, living in Brooklyn, there's this spot in Dumbo, which is a neighborhood in Brooklyn, overlooking the Brooklyn Bridge, looking at, with a complete view of the Manhattan skyline. And whenever I'm there, I always feel this deep sense of connectedness, And again, as I mentioned earlier, this division, right, between nature and human creation is actually an unnecessary division, because yes, our experiences of it are distinct, but the reality is that we are all part of nature, so it's more about coming into balance, coming into relationship, right? And relationship doesn't happen if you continue to create divisions between you and the thing, right? I think that this is an interesting place maybe to be considering Virgo, right? Virgo is often associated with the stereotype for criticality, right? And yes, the action of Virgo may seem critical, but in truth, Virgo energy to me is so much about practicing the willingness to change as the heart of aliveness, right? And Virgo also contains inherently some contradictions. So the sign of Virgo, the ruler of Virgo is Mercury, right? Mercury is often associated with writing. Mercury is associated with the mind. Mercury is associated with language, right? But Virgo is an earth sign, right? And so there almost is, to our sensibility as modern people who are operating within Western framework, there can be the sense of like, this doesn't really make sense, right? Like, how can Virgo be connected to the mind, but then also connected to the earth sign? Isn't the earth connected with the body, right? Isn't the earth connected to the soil? How is the soil part of the mind as well? And one of the ways I've been thinking about this is how the earth itself is a library, right? Like the earth is a library of all of the beings that comprise the earth. The earth, there's this theory, right, about how everything that has existed in the earth has never actually left the earth, right? Because there is this natural process of coming together, right? And creation of an organism that becomes a being, right? That is a multicellular organism that then decomposes and then feeds the system again, right? So this idea that our minds, right, are not really parts of our bodies is kind of a fallacy, right? And so in thinking about change too, I think that Virgo understands, right, that everything changes, that becoming a willing participant in that change, practicing change, right, actively is part of saying yes to our aliveness. And the final thing I want to mention is how in the middle of this week, we are going to be experiencing Mercury meeting with the Sun, which we often call Mercury cazimi. And this is a point in Mercury's journey during its retrograde period that's often associated with illumination, right? I like to think about it as the sun gifting Mercury a little bit of its illumination, right? And a vision that I was feeling into for this particular Mercury cazimi is someone who's maybe been working outside for a while, right? Maybe a farmer or a gardener or a delivery person who's been looking down and focusing on getting their work done. And then suddenly they caught this glimmer of the sun, right? It's like that moment when maybe you've been working on your garden and you've been so focused on the plants, and then suddenly you realize that, wow, like the sunlight is really coming in. And then that moment becomes a moment when you pause, right? And allow yourself to drink in the awe of the sunlight. The Mercury cazimi moment is also colored by a Gemini moon, right? So when Mercury is meeting the sun in Virgo, the moon is creating a square aspect to Sun and Mercury from Gemini, right? And so both luminaries, the sun and the moon, are ruled by Mercury here, right? I think this is such a great time to be attuning to where your interest is. Where are you being pulled? What interests are emerging for you, right? Where are you feeling yourself pulled towards? And it may also be interesting to reflect on how your interests have shifted since the beginning of the year. How have you changed in terms of your self-expression, in terms of how you define yourself, right? How have you transformed in terms of what matters to you and how you transmit that interest? How have you morphed in terms of the words that maybe you use to describe yourself, your relationships, your work in the world, right? And the world that you live in. You may remember, if you've been living alongside astrology, that we started the year off with a Mars retrograde, right? And that Mars retrograde was happening in Gemini. So if it feels accessible to you right now, and if it feels good, I invite you to close your eyes, and recall or remember this part of you that was starting the year. For a lot of us, 2023 is a pretty big year where there have been a lot of shifts, and if closing your eyes is not available to you at this moment, you can bring awareness, to a part of your body that feels good to rest your attention on, or some being in your surrounding, right? And allow yourself to sink deeper into this moment now and begin feeling the gap between the version of you that's listening to this right now and the version of you at the start of the year. And there may have been differences, They may be subtle, they may be very strong, and this activity may even bring up a lot, right? So I invite you to be gentle with yourself and to also really honor your process. Mercury to me is the patron saint of process in general. The astrologer Jason Hawley has spoken about Mercury as, being the planet, being the archetypal force whose primary agenda is to move the plot along, right? Mercury is the movable agent, right? Depending on where Mercury is in the natal chart, Mercury can be part of the day team or the night team, right? Diurnal or lunar, active or passive, and so forth, right? Mercury inhabits that energy of being neither nor or both and, right? And so with Mercury, with this particular Mercury cazimi, I invite you to dilate your attention to that thread that has been holding you through different versions or different iterations of yourself throughout this past year, right? And to give yourself permission to start maybe collecting this data, right? Start noticing, how have I changed? Why have I changed? What am I moving towards? And to maybe remember, right? Like literally remember, right? As in integrate as a member of your conscious awareness parts of yourself that have been left in the past. There is something about remembering past versions of ourselves that can be really, really, really powerful, because in doing so, we get to more fully tap into all of the different ways that our story is actually always whole, right? No matter how many pivots we've had to make, no matter how many changes we've been moving through, no matter how many decays and decompositions and shifts we've been moving through, the reality is that there is a part of us that is fixed, right? Like, you're still you, no matter what. And recovering these different pieces that have always been holding that core part is, I think, a really powerful thing to incorporate into this coming week. All right, friends, that's it by way of contemplation. I'm so grateful for your time, for your attention, for your presence. And my hope is that this space that we are co-creating has been helpful for you, that they've served you. And yeah, I'm excited to see you next week. And I'm wishing you a week of gentleness, of care, and of reintegration of your spiritual dimension and your embodied mundane dimensions. All right, take care.